And it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Stephen Tiffany, who was my first employee at the primate lab at Duke University. So we're both out of the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and Steve went on to do wonderful things, including being chair of the Department of Psychology at the University of Buffalo. And he's going to speak to us today about craving, reward, and smoking, a new procedure for probing nicotine motivation.
Thank you. Thank you, Jed. Thank you, Ed, for taking a risk many years ago and hiring me. You changed the life course for me. I want to just start out by thanking the people who worked with me on the projects that I'm going to be presenting today. These are graduate students and colleagues at the University of Buffalo. Let's start out talking about craving. I'm going to talk about the conventional view of craving, the one that most people in the field endorse, although probably no one in any one room would admit to it. And this is the idea that craving is at the motivational core of addiction. Some sort of conditions trigger craving. Craving, in turn, induces drug use, ongoing drug use in the smoker, for instance, or relapse in the smoker attempting to quit smoking. From this perspective, craving is seen as necessary but not sufficient for tobacco use. Now, there is an alternative view that roughly looks like this, and this is the idea that craving and tobacco use are controlled by only partially overlapping processes, can be depicted this way. Craving systems generate craving, drug motivational systems generate tobacco use, and there is some overlap between these two processes. From this perspective, craving is neither necessary nor sufficient for tobacco use. Now, despite the disputes about the role of craving and motivational significance of craving in tobacco use, there's really no dispute that craving can be readily triggered by presentations of cues to cigarette smokers. And we can take advantage of the cue specificity of craving in laboratory studies, and there have been literally hundreds of cue-reactivity studies over the years looking at craving. Now, the cue-reactivity paradigm is very straightforward. Drug users are presented with stimuli that are previously associated with their past instances of drug use. So, for instance, a cigarette smoker might be asked to look at a photo of someone smoking cigarettes, and then craving is assessed. A variety of modes have been used to present cues over the years: photos, in vivo, imagery, video, virtual realities coming on strong these days. And then people look at a variety of cue reactions. Most prominently, what we see in these studies is craving is assessed, but there are other things that people have looked at as well. I'm going to show you an example of a cue reactivity study from our laboratory published several years ago. Smokers, heavy cigarette smokers, were asked to either look at photos of people smoking cigarettes and cigarette cues, or hold a cigarette in front of them. They did multiple trials. After each trial, they were asked about their craving level, and these are the kinds of data you see. You see that when people are looking at smoking cues, either photos or in vivo, we see substantially stronger craving to smoke than when they're looking at neutral stimuli. The cue effect size here, that's partial eta squared, is enormous, and this is typically what we see in the cue reactivity field when you look at craving. So that brings us to the question is, what's the association between craving and smoking? We recently, or relatively recently, completed two meta-analyses, one clinical studies looking at the relationship between craving and relapse in cigarette smokers, the other one looking at the relationship between craving and drug use behaviors in laboratory and preclinical studies. In our clinical studies, we found that craving is not a strong predictor of tobacco relapse. Even when it is a significant predictor, it accounts for only very small amounts of variance. Similarly, in laboratory studies, we found that craving and tobacco use are only modestly related. But curiously, we found that the nature of the tobacco use measure had a major impact on the strength of the association. More about that in a few seconds. Just in general, though, when we look at the data on craving and drug use, it's not at all supportive of the conventional model. The data just don't support that model. The alternative model's alive. It's certainly not confirmed by the disconfirmation of the other, but it is still alive. There are, though, a number of remaining issues in assessing the associations between craving and drug use in cue-reactivity studies. First of all, very few cue-reactivity studies actually include drug use measures. In our meta-analyses, we could only find 7 such studies out of potential. I think there were 40 or so studies that could have included them. Measures of drug use and cue exposure are often not collected in close temporal contiguity, and we know that temporal distance degrades correlations. We're concerned about the potential unreliability measures, not unreliability of craving. We've nailed craving. We have no trouble measuring craving with extremely high reliability. It's unreliability of the drug use measures. Often it's only one measure which has reliability that cannot be calculated. Or even if it could be calculated, it's not reported. And finally, as I've suggested, there's this complexity of the drug use measure. What do we mean by that? Let's parse drug use just a little bit. At a very gross level, we can think about seeking versus consumption. Seeking is everything that people do to get to cigarettes, get to nicotine, and consumption is what they do then, once they have it, to get it into their body. Now, we also know that there's another distinction, and I'm glad that Jed talked about automaticity earlier because it helps me go through this piece very quickly. The idea that with repeated practice under fixed stimulus conditions, behavior becomes increasingly automatized. It's just a rule of psychology. We know that's a fact. Automatic behavior tends to be uncontrolled, very goal-independent, stimulus-driven, autonomous, unconscious, efficient, as opposed to non-automatic behavior, which has to occur when the automatic processes aren't sufficient to the task, or automatic processes are interrupted and now you have to engage non-automatic processes to get the job done. These tend to be cognitively demanding, effortful, very deliberative. People have to think a lot about this, very goal-dependent, and conscious. In a model I presented many years ago, I equated craving with the activation of non-automatic cognitive processes. Now let's parse drug use according to this fourfold table, seeking and consumption crossed with automatic, non-automatic, and you end up with these 4 cells. In our meta-analyses, we were able to distinguish automatic drug-seeking measures and non-automatic drug-seeking measures. When we looked at consumption measures, we couldn't make that distinction in the data that were available to us, so we just lumped consumption together. Here then is what we found. By the way, here are some examples of various kinds of measures. Seeking, automatic seeking would be latency to smoke under unconstrained conditions. Non-automatic seeking would be choice behavior. Lee Hogarth's cigarette versus chocolate is what he does in his studies. Breakpoint measure, cigarette purchase task, McKillop's cigarette purchase task. Puffs earned in an instrumental task. Sherry McKee's time to delay smoking with momentary incentive. And then consumption would be things like number of cigarettes smoked under ad lib conditions, or a more fine-grained puff topography analysis of smoking under ad lib conditions, or under ad lib access. Okay, here's what we found. Here's consumption, automatic seeking, non-automatic seeking. K refers to the number of correlation coefficients. You can see that overall, the omnibus R was 0.20, a very small, modest, yet significant effect. But the effect was strongly moderated by the nature of the measure. For consumption and automatic seeking, the correlations were 0.15. For non-automatic seeking, they went to 0.34. More than double in size and 5 times more shared variance when you make this simple distinction as a function of what the nature of the drug use measure was. So, and that difference, by the way, was significant. Now, we were generally dissatisfied as we looked at the cue-reactivity literature, not only our studies, and we've done a lot of them, but other studies as well. And here were our problems. Often we had exposure to cues with no drug availability. In the field, it's very common to have a look but do not touch kind of approach. And we know from our research and the research of others, availability can have a strong impact on the magnitude of cue reactivity that you get. With availability, you get stronger reactivity. As I said, you rarely see measures of use, either seeking or consumption, in these studies. measures of use are often not collected in close temporal contiguity to the presentation of the cue. There's the potential unreliability of the use measures. And finally, measures of use sometimes involve hypothetical outcomes, not real outcomes. The cigarette purchase task is entirely hypothetical. Lee Hogarth's choice task is hypothetical. People don't actually get the cigarette or the chocolate. Even at the end of the study, they don't get it. They're told they're going to get it, but they don't get it. And we sort of thought that real outcomes probably had more punch than hypothetical outcomes when you're talking about drug use behavior. So we needed a new cue-reactivity procedure. And we wanted to have the following features. First, we wanted it to have the very strong methodological features of our previous cue-reactivity designs. We wanted drug potentially available on each drug cue trial. We wanted seeking and consumption measures on each trial. We wanted measures of use collected in close temporal contiguity to cue presentation. We wanted to run multiple trials to increase reliability. And finally, we wanted real outcomes for all variables. So strap in, I'm going to take you through a bunch of studies right now with this new procedure. We call it the choice behavior under cued conditions, CBUCC. I know it doesn't roll off your tongue, but we're working on that. Here's the basic design. People sit in a small room at a table. They see a monitor, a keyboard, and a mouse. And then they see a chamber in front of them. The chamber is covered by a sliding glass door. The door opens up from the bottom. And in that chamber, they see either a lit cigarette, their own brand, or a cup of water. So that's the setup. Here's a trial. People sit with their eyes closed. They hear a tone. They open their eyes, and they look at the cue. They see either the cigarette or they see the cup of water. They then rate their craving. They rate it on the screen. We run multiple items of craving to increase reliability. We then say, select an amount of money to spend to gain access to the cue right now on this trial. Here's what they do. They see this choice screen. They spend from 1 cent to 25 cents. 1 cent, there's a 5% probability the door will be unlocked right now. All the way up to 25 cents, there's a 95% probability the door will be locked, and all these amounts in between. It's real money. They're given 10 bucks. What they don't spend, they take home with them. So they're spending real money. They make their choice, and then they put their hand on a starting point, they hear a tone, and they try to open the door. And the door is either locked or unlocked according to the probabilities that they've sort of spent for. Spent more money, chances are much higher the door is going to open. If it's unlocked, they get a chance to sample the cue. The sample, they take a puff, or they take a sip of water. They do some additional ratings. If the door is locked, they go right to the ratings. Trial's over, they go to the next trial. That's it. That's the trial. Very simple. People learn it very quickly. Very engaged in this as well. Here are primary measures. Non-automatic seeking is simply the amount of money that they spend per trial. Automatic seeking is a latency to open the door. We have a micro switch built in the door, so any little bit of movement, we can pick that up. Consumption is puff duration that we get from video recordings, or we weigh the water before and after. And then craving on every trial. I'm going to focus on non-automatic seeking and craving in this particular presentation. Here's our first study. We had 30 smokers. They are very heavy smokers. They went through one CBUCC session, 40 total trials, 20 water, 20 cigarettes, randomly intermixed. And then again, they had the $10 to spend, and there were the probabilities. First of all, the reliabilities that we see with CBUCC are extremely high. For cigarette craving, they range in the 90s. For spending, they range in the 90s. For all our other variables that we collect as well, they're very, very high. Why? Because we have so many trials. I can't show you reliability for consumption because it varies from person to person, and as you know, reliability calculation, you can have unequal numbers of items, for instance, per test to do the reliability. The puff duration tends to be relatively long per puff, over 3.5 seconds. If you think of a regular cigarette, 11 puffs, this is a very long puff. People are really sucking it in when they have a chance to do it. First of all, it generates strong cue-specific craving, much higher or stronger, more significantly stronger craving for cigarettes and water. The partial eta squared is 0.45. That's a very large effect size. Spending. They spent 3 times more to get access to a cigarette, this is per trial, than access to water, 9 cents versus 3 cents. Again, a very, very strong partial eta squared here, effect size. So that's our first study. We had high reliability for the major variables. We had very clear cue-specific craving effects. And we had very robust differences in the amount of money that they used to access the cues. A second study, again, very heavy cigarette smokers. Now we're looking at the effect of abstinence on our CBUCC variables. People attended 2 sessions. In the morning was an orientation session. At the end of that session, they were assigned to be abstinent or non-abstinent for the next 6 hours. They then came back 6 hours later and went through the CBUCC session. Here are the craving data. What you can see is the craving generally is higher when people are abstinent than non-abstinent. Big surprise. Pretty easy effect to get. We see cue-specific craving under both conditions. The magnitude of cue-specific craving is exactly the same whether people are abstinent or non-abstinent. You don't see here a selective increase in sensitivity to cues when people haven't smoked for 6 hours. We have never found that, and in fact, no one in the literature has ever found that. So this is not unusual. Seems somewhat counterintuitive to some folks, but we don't see that. Here's the spending. Again, people spend significantly more for cigarettes than for water, but now when they're abstinent, they spend even more for cigarettes. They spend 3 cents more. So spending is sensitive to this abstinence manipulation. And just to back up, that difference is significant. You can see that by the relative effect sizes that are listed there. Okay, a third study. We said, well, let's look at this new stuff, e-cigarettes, and let's compare people's reactions to e-cigarettes versus tobacco cigarettes. And so we recruited people who were dual users, which is, as it turns out, the majority of adult users of e-cigarettes also use tobacco cigarettes. And they were regular users of both. And now we presented them with either cigarettes, an e-cigarette, actually their e-cigarette, their own brand of e-cigarettes, or water on a number of trials, all intermixed, randomized, and all that nice stuff. Here are the craving data. If you focus on the tobacco cigarette craving side, you can see that we're getting strong cue-specific craving here, once again. If you look at the e-cigarette craving side, we're getting e-cigarette craving. Craving's higher when people are looking at an e-cigarette for e-cigarettes, craving for e-cigarettes, than when looking at water or tobacco. Interestingly, presentation of tobacco cues suppressed craving for e-cigarettes. A curious effect. There are a lot of fun little nuances in these studies, but in order to sort of give you the 30,000-foot view, I'm not going to belabor any of these particular points. And CBUCC generated clear, robust differences in spending for both cigarette types. I'm sorry. All these effects here are significant. So they spent more for cigarettes, conventional or e-cigarettes, than for water, and they spent more for tobacco cigarettes than for e-cigarettes. Significantly more. Okay, another CBUCC study. This is looking at alcohol and cigarette cues in people who use both, because as we heard, many people who smoke drink, and many people who drink smoke. We intentionally recruited people who used from very low to very high levels of cigarettes and drank at very low levels to very high levels of alcohol. And we did that intentionally because we had some other things going on in this study. The cues we presented were fourfold. They either saw water, cigarette, alcohol, their preferred beverage, or we did a combined trial of both cigarettes and alcohol. CBUCC again generated clear cue-specific cigarette craving. When cigarettes were presented alone or in combination with alcohol, we got significant elevations in craving. Presentation of alcohol cues did not elevate cigarette craving in this study. CBUCC also generated clear cue-specific alcohol craving. Alcohol presented alone or in combination with cigarettes generated higher craving to drink alcohol relative to water, cigarettes. Here, cigarettes did not produce an increase in alcohol craving. There's no cross-cueing effect going on here across these two substances in this particular sample of participants. And here's the spending. Every single spending difference you see here is significant. More for alcohol cigarettes and combined than water. More combined is higher than cigarette, and cigarette in turn is higher than alcohol. Okay, one last study. We thought we'd branch out besides drugs of abuse, and we'd look at another thing. It turns out that most cigarette smokers also eat, which kind of surprised us, but it's kind of handy. So we took cigarette smokers, and they attended 2 CBUCC sessions. On one, they were non-abstinent. On the other session, they were overnight abstinent. So now we're going from 6 hours to a longer period of abstinence for these people. And we presented them with 3 kinds of cue trials: a lit cigarette, a food, their favorite candy, or water. Multiple trials of each intermixed and all of that stuff. So here's what we see. Again, we see evidence of cue-specific craving. Abstinence overall, by the way, increases craving. Abstinence, once again, does not produce any selective increase in cue specificity. Believe me, what you're seeing here is cue-specific craving for cigarettes, not for food, relative to food and water. The effect is exactly the same whether people are abstinent or non-abstinent. Again, this is what we typically see in our research and what everyone else finds. We also saw evidence of cue-specific food craving. Craving for food was higher under the food trials than the cigarette or the water trials, but abstinence had absolutely no impact on food craving in this study. And then finally, here are the spending data. Cigarettes, food, and water. People spent more for cigarettes than for food, more for food than for water. Abstinence had no impact on food spending or water spending, but it did on cigarette craving. So it selectively elevated people's spending, and that difference is significant. There is a significant interaction, and that difference is indeed significant. So I've shown you now 5 studies with CBUCC. Let me show you some correlations. These are across the various studies I've already depicted. These are looking at correlations of craving with the spending variable and with the consumption variable. In each of these studies in various conditions, there are 9 different kinds of conditions represented here. Most of these are cigarette craving. There's also alcohol craving and e-cigarette craving embedded in here as well. And what we see is that the correlation averages 0.46 between craving and spending. 7 of the 9 correlation coefficients were significant. That 0.46 is very high, by the way, compared to what, the 0.34 that I showed you before in the literature. It's very high. Compared to 0.16 across all of these conditions for consumption, 2 of the 9 were significant. The 0.16, though, is very close to the 0.15 we found in our meta-analysis. I mean, hard to get much closer than that. I guess we could have gotten 0.15, but you probably wouldn't have believed me. But if we look at this 0.46, it's very high. It's very high, I think, because we have such reliable measures. We have so many trials. We have all of the nice features of things measured in close continuity. It's real money. It's real tobacco. It's real whatever. But it's still not perfect. It's only 21% shared variance. So I think it's still consistent with this idea of only partially overlapping processes between craving systems and drug motivational systems. There are some continuing issues with CBUCC, or things we're trying to explore. We're looking at the predictive validity right now of CBUCC. We have it embedded in a very large treatment trial so that we can look to see what the CBUCC variables tell us about treatment outcome. We're also very interested in motivational manipulations, continued motivational manipulations over and above abstinence. This trial is a trial of looking at varenicline versus placebo. And we are already looking at the data we've looked at. We're seeing very strong signals within CBUCC, interestingly, for women, not for men. I also want to talk just a few seconds about our conceptualization of spending. We think it's a very good index of non-automatic seeking. But we think in general it's also a very good measure of the reward value of what's behind that door that people can get to. People are saying, I'm willing to spend this much money, real money, to get real access right now to sample that cue. And they do it across multiple trials. And I think in many ways that's sort of the definition at least a face valid level of reward value. So we think we really have a very good measure here of reward value. So what do we get from CBUCC? In summary, we get very reliable measures. We get very strong cue-specific craving. We get robust cue-specific spending. So craving and spending cue specificity for tobacco cigarettes, e-cigarettes, alcohol, food. What am I leaving out? Lots of stuff. We get strong correlations between craving and spending with this procedure. And by the way, I should also point out that I don't have up here, our participants love this task. For those of you who run a lot of humans and a lot of your studies, humans typically don't love your studies. They don't love my studies, by and large. They're bored, silly. They love this task, for what it's worth. But it also allows us the opportunity to get direct comparisons across rewards on multiple motivational variables, some of which I haven't been able to talk about here. So we think that this is a kind of cue-reactivity procedure that we're very happy with. We think it has tremendous potential. And I invite those of you who would like to try it out to come and talk with me, because we think it's pretty nifty and we get really whopping effects with it. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Steve. That was great. Set things off to a great start, and you followed through. I'll start with Jed, per usual.
Yeah, sorry, I have a lot of questions. No, it was really great, Steve. Really cool paradigm. And a couple of questions. Well, one kind of methodologic. In terms of, you talked about cigarette deprivation, but have you also manipulated the food deprivation when you, no, so that's always standardized?
No, food is standardized. They come in not having had breakfast, but that's it.
Got it, okay, yeah. So, but in terms of the measures you can get, and in particular the predictive value in an actual quit study, which I think could be really useful, so you can get the active cue minus neutral cue difference, but then you could just look at overall latency too in terms of whether internal variables are driving the behavior. Are you looking at both those? Not just, because the tendency would be to look at the specific measure, the active minus neutral cue differential, but I assume you're also going to look at just overall latency, and does that predict relapse?
We will leave no stone unturned.
Well, I would imagine so.
Yes, we will. We will.
How long does it take to administer that test?
It depends on the number of trials, but we can typically get it done in 45 minutes. It's overkill on trials, by the way. We don't need that many trials to get the reliabilities that we would like. But yes, we can do it in about 45 to 60. It depends on how slow people are. Some people just take forever to decide how much they're going to spend, which we measure, by the way, as a latency variable in that too, which is interesting.
Right. One last quick question on that is with the trend so far for a sex difference, so is that on the specific measure, the active minus neutral cue, because that would potentially tie in with women being more cue responsive?
Well, first of all, we find no evidence in our data that women are more responsive to smoking cues with craving data, with craving cue activity, than men. We find no difference, and we can't find any difference in the literature, actually, as a matter of fact. There might be some evidence in some other reactivity measures that they are. The study that we're doing is actually a replication of a smaller study where we're looking at, based actually on your ideas of looking at pre-quit varenicline for several weeks relative to placebo. And in our initial study, we found that we did get a pre-quit effect, but for women, not for men. Interestingly enough, we don't know what the outcomes are, the quitting outcomes are now, but already in CBUCC, we're seeing spending differences, a decline in spending for women, but not for men as a function of varenicline. Which is cool, but stay tuned.
Yeah, one question I had was, it makes sense that the trials are distributed through the entire period of testing. But if you look from the beginning to the end, have you looked for priming effects? That is, that as they get exposed to nicotine, there is a responses on the cues and the money changes?
Yes, the nice thing about this too, particularly when you do get to larger sample sizes, and you can do trial-to-trial sorts of analyses, and we've done those profile analyses and continue to do them. We're very interested in things like what happens if you get nicotine, what impact does it have on subsequent craving or spending, and or if you don't hit, you spend a lot of money and you're disappointed, what happens? And there are some interesting things that happen there. What we are, since we have 300 plus people, we're putting it all together now to do a major analysis across all of that and see what happens on a trial-to-trial basis. So again, you're going to have to stay tuned on that. But yes, we're very interested in what happens dynamically within a session, which is nice with this procedure because you can do that.
Yes, Steve, that was just awesome. That's just amazing. It's bothered me for years that we don't look at cue-provoked smoking, and we've been doing it now for the last 3 or 4 years. We're not doing it as elegantly as you are, but it would be great to talk to you about incorporating this technique. What I wanted to ask you about was, you mentioned that when given access to a cigarette, these smokers are taking what look like really large puffs, 3.5 seconds. So a couple questions about that. One, how are you measuring that? Do you have other topography measures? And then finally, do you think that allowing smokers to sort of self-administer as much smoke as they want is somehow affecting that correlation between consumption and craving that you see?
It's an excellent question. First of all, I think you're correct. People, as you noted, are smoking a tremendous amount. They're really dragging on that. We think they're smoking somewhat strategically. That is, this is my chance. I better take it in while I can. We thought that perhaps we had a measure of automatic consumption. We don't think that we do. We think they're thinking a lot about it and adjusting their behavior accordingly. The question about what impact that has on correlations, we don't really know, and that's something that we may have the data to tease out, to look at. There was another aspect. I was just so basking in your praise that sorry. Oh, other measures of topography. No, we don't in this particular study. We do have the means to do it. We're about to do it. We look at respiration so that we can get inhalation. And also, and this is a bit of an aside, most topography that you get through a crest, for instance, doesn't capture smoke holding, which we found is pretty important for smoke exposure. And so with respiration, you can get that. So all we get is that initial inhalation that we get from a video recording.
Hi, yeah, thank you for your talk. That's a really interesting paradigm. I'm really interested in the monetary aspect of it and kind of, have you had anyone have to work for the money you're giving them? Because if you give a child $10 of their parents' money, they're more willing to spend it willy-nilly versus giving someone $10 that they've actually worked for.
No, they worked for it by showing up in the lab, I guess, which is work. But no, and there's the artificial aspect of it, but yes, we do ask about income and disposable income and things like that and correlate that with amounts spent. We find that doesn't seem to produce much association. But in terms of how they got the money and what they get to keep, it's not a lot of money, actually, if you think about it. But curiously, people are even spending money for water. They could spend 1 cent on every trial, but no, they're spending on average, and across our studies, 3 cents, 3 times as much as they need to. But I think part of it is there is a little bit of a gambling. Well, it's an instrumental task. This is an instrumental task, and gambling is an instrumental task. So I think they get engaged a little bit in that. What's going to happen if I spend this? They might be getting a little thirsty too.
Thank you very much. This is a beautiful technique, and it looks really great. So I have 2 questions. The first is a technique question. Were the subjects able to smell the lit cigarette prior to responding?
No, we ventilate the box with a pretty extensive ventilation system that draws it through the box and out through. So they can't, but of course, once the door is open, they can smell it, but not while they're doing the rating. Now, there is residual smoke that comes into the room, so there's that sort of little bit of stench of smoke in the air.
Right, okay, all right.
Let me, one thing that we did that I didn't go into in the alcohol study, there's been a problem in the literature with alcohol cues producing not very strong cue-specific craving effects, which we thought we wanted to see if we could amp that up. So in that study, people, as part of CBUCC, opened the door, took the cue, smelled it, or held the lit cigarette, and then put it back, and then they did the spending and all of that. So in that study, they could smell. And by the way, we got very strong cue-specific alcohol craving, as strong an effect size as we got for tobacco, which you don't see in the literature typically. It tends to be about half the size, so we think that that helped amp up the cue-specific craving effect for alcohol.
All right, so my last question pertains to what are your thoughts around exploring the norepinephrine side of this approach? Have you ever thought about taking like a person being treated with clonidine or atomoxetine, that approach, to see if you could explore that end of it as opposed to the dopamine side?
Well, this procedure is open to all sorts of other manipulations and people under all sorts of pharmacotherapies and pharmacological exposures. So yes, you could use it in all sorts of ways. So it certainly would be possible. And I would invite people to think about using it that way. We're very, very pleased with the spending variable. And one of the nice things about the spending variable is it's absolute. That's on a ratio scale. We can say that people value cigarettes 3 times more than water, for instance. And we can say that.
Or just, yeah, quick follow-up to Joe's question and this question about the extraordinarily, longer than expected puff duration. We did a study once where video topography was used to assess puff duration, and it's kind of tricky in terms of, do you time when it goes into the mouth and when it comes out of the mouth, or when the burning, the cone of the cigarette flares? Because if it's from like touching the mouth and then leaving the mouth, that can actually be longer than the actual drag on the cigarette.
No, we really zoom in on the tip and we look at the glow.
Oh, okay.
So it's probably closer to the puff. We'll know soon from respiratory. Actually, we're doing another study unrelated to that, and what we're getting from respiration versus what we're getting from video recording is pretty close, within maybe 100 milliseconds or so.
Hi. It struck me that the aspects of that paradigm that worked out the most beautifully are the evaluative, resource-consuming aspects of smoking, which is related to craving, and which is, I'm sorry, it's really not that hard to assess. But what's more elusive generally is the more automatic component that you're saying is related to the latency, to how fast you grab the cigarette or the water glass.
Right.
And there didn't seem to be much on that. So I was wondering how well that paradigm is suited to really get at that dissociation and also measure the other aspect, the automatic aspect.
That's an excellent question, because I have a confession. It was actually in my talk earlier, but I took it out because I was running way over. Latency stinks as a measure. We found absolutely no evidence of differences in latency between cigarette trials and water trials or any of the other combinations. We also think latency to open a door is probably not an automatic aspect of smoking. You don't open doors to smoke. It doesn't work that way. So it's probably not very well suited for looking at at automatic seeking. We did design this task because we really wanted to nail non-automatic seeking. We really wanted to amplify and emphasize that aspect of the behavior. So we think we have a consumption measure that shows some promise. We certainly have a non-automatic seeking measure that does. In terms of automatic seeking, no, not yet. We've done even things like once they open the door, how quickly do they reach for the cigarette? We've coded all of that, and we're not finding a heck of a lot in that either. Well, no, there is. There are some self-report measures. We've done some studies where we've looked at sort of the regularity of people smoking, but it's A heavy smoker smokes a cigarette. It's like a fingerprint. It's amazing. The same number of puffs, the same puff duration, the puff, all of that stuff. How quickly routinized it becomes for them, which is sort of surprising that when they're forced to, they'll take a long puff if they have to. They are able to break that up.
Two easy questions. Do the subjects have equal access to the products post-test? So, for example, I can have my shot of whiskey or whatever it is post-test in the same time period or time frame as the other products?
No, probably not. I mean, cigarettes are quite portable. Whiskey's portable to an extent, but they'd have to go somewhere typically to get it.
Right.
So, no.
And how do you account for the money value for each separate product? So one drag of a cigarette is worth less than a gulp of a scotch or whatever your favorite product is.
What I didn't show, for instance, so we do have to calibrate. We did calibrate in the alcohol cigarette study amount of money that they could spend. So there it was from 1 to 40 cents because we didn't want a ceiling effect. We didn't want floor effects. And that's a nice thing you can do with this procedure. You can stick different amounts in there. Now, it was the same on every trial. So on every trial, they had from 1 to 40 cents to spend with corresponding increases in probability. But we thought long and hard about that.
So you might say that the whiskey is portable and potable. but
Yes.
Following up on Britta Hahn's point about the seeking a measure of automatic smoking, so just for clarification, when you say you didn't see anything, I mean, in one sense, if it's automatic, you wouldn't see any differences or effects of variables, and that might be a good measure, but
It's possible.
or do you mean that it's not reliable within subject, which would mean it's just not?
No, it's very reliable and consistent across subjects. The reliability on latency is in the 90s as well.
So,
But,
so maybe it is a measure of automaticity.
But what we thought is that people would reach more quickly for a door with a cigarette behind it than for a door with water behind it. We're not seeing that.
Well, reaching for water is highly automatic too.
Well, that could be. It should be a piece of chalk, for instance, or something like that. That's the thing. Water is a reinforcer.
Right. Are you giving like questionnaire either the old Russell items or the wisdom? You have a questionnaire for automatic smoking, right?
Yeah.
So does that correlate with anything? No.
No, but in most of our studies, we recruit very heavy cigarette smokers. And so we don't have much variability here. We have restriction of range, so as a consequence, we wouldn't expect robust. Yes, we do have automaticity items, but what we found with automaticity, when you get people who are smoking 20 cigarettes a day or more and have been doing it for 30 years or 20 years, we have a lot of very highly automated smokers. We also have found from other studies, I developed years ago a questionnaire on automatic smoking, and there's some irony there. The more automatic you are, the less you know about it. I don't smoke. What are you talking about? I'm not a smoker.
How about one more question on Steve's talk, and then we can open it up for the...
Yeah, reinforcers are always relative based on, I think, need. Have you ever looked at people's relative response when they're dehydrated?
No, but that's something you could do with this.
Because, I mean, again, that would give you a balance in terms of how survival-based is their drive for water versus nicotine or alcohol.
Yes, and one thing we like about this procedure is that can be done on separate trials, but yet in the same people, as opposed to a choice task where people are asked to choose between a cigarette and water. If you see a difference as a function of some deprivation manipulation or general motivational manipulation, you can never tell, is it because one's going down and the other's going up? You can't tell with choice tasks. They just don't allow you to penetrate that question. This, because it's money versus something, you can compare those somethings.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we've had a great discussion of Steve's talk. Are there any points that people want to bring up about the previous talks, things that we've talked about this morning? Yeah. I
had a question, and this is as a clinician, I want to take some of the information given and see if I can make sense of it. But specifically, the relationship between alcohol and tobacco use. So many treatment centers still allow tobacco smoking in their facilities. And many of us have been screaming for years that that's probably not a very good idea. And I just wondered if the literature or your study has shown that tobacco is a powerful enhancer for return to alcohol use for people in recovery.
I guess I'll take a crack at it. So for alcohol and nicotine, co-consumption studies at the preclinical level, there really hasn't been too many labs that look at voluntary alcohol and nicotine consumption in mice. So there's two labs, A.D. Lay's lab at the University of Toronto, who has operant self-administration of nicotine combined with operant oral self-administration of alcohol, and then Mike Bardow's lab at the University of Kentucky. They've done some of these studies where now you can start to evaluate, okay, so how do we push and pull different neurobiological mechanisms or different pharmacology to see if with animals that have free choice access to both of these drugs, how does deprivation of one affect the other, or how does drugs affect one over the other? And if I remember some of A.D. Lay's research correctly, he's found that animals that are co-consuming both of them, that if the presence of one drug, I think he phrased it as it inhibits the extinction of the other. So that's really interesting, data that might speak to some of the clinical work. So these are incredibly difficult, technically challenging studies to get rats to, you have to have IV catheters, and then you have to train them for 2 different substances. And so for a lot of the people that work in the mouse literature, such as Andrew and myself, who want to take advantage of the technological tools and the genetic tools available in mice to really start to dissect these things, I've turned to 3-bottle choice studies in my lab. And so we have mice that are individually housed. They get a bottle of alcohol, a bottle of nicotine, a bottle of water, free choice access, as much food and water as they want. And we just leave them alone. So these are black 6 genetic lines of mice. They are very high drinking in the first place. So what I found is that if we give animals 3 weeks of concurrent access to alcohol and nicotine, and we take away their alcohol bottle, and we leave them the nicotine and the water, the consumption of nicotine increases during that alcohol abstinence week for both the milligrams per kilogram consumption as well as the preference for the nicotine bottle compared to everything else. When you then give them back the alcohol bottle the next week, everything falls back to their pre-forced abstinence levels. So, we're still, this is like the model is in its very infancy. We're trying to get a sense of how, what is involved in all of this. How do we get more reliable measures? We're just weighing the bottles once a day. We're trying to, build a 3D printable ligometer system that can live in these cages so we can get relationships between alcohol and nicotine consumption at a free choice level. Do they drink the alcohol first? Do they drink the nicotine first? What happens with drugs? So in fact, a lot of what I do is I actually look to the clinical literature to see, am I modeling something that's correct? Am I doing something that's interesting and useful? So if I can just expand on that, we have tried to take some of the alcohol binge models that exist out there and translate it into nicotine, just to see if we can shorten the amount of time that the animals are drinking nicotine so that we can use pharmacology, which is metabolized much more quickly in mice. So if we want to take a look at varenicline, it only lasts for at most an hour in mice. And so if we're looking at overnight consumption of nicotine, there's no way we can capture that. And we tried getting, if you shrink the drug access for alcohol in mice, they'll learn to compress their drinking in a shortened amount of time. So it's like last call. They'll rush all their drinking in the short amount of time. We tried the exact same thing for nicotine, and it never worked. Of course it doesn't work. People don't binge nicotine. So it's like this drug, what we see in the preclinical work, we never published this obviously, but it just doesn't work. It's not bingeable. And you look at the human clinical literature, it's just not a behavior that is shown. So there is a lot of back and forth that, at least I do trying to model some of the things that are real in the human world.
Just in terms of the human clinical trials that do test whether subjecting people to smoking cessation treatment impedes their recovery from other addictions, my impression is that it doesn't hurt. So Teresa Winhusen did a big study of incorporating smoking cessation treatment in a substance use program. It was a multi-center NIDA network trial, and as I recall, the outcome was that it does not hurt people to quit smoking when they're trying to kick other substances, whereas going way back, people thought, oh, just give people one task at a time, right? So anyway, there is some literature on that.
And again, that is very important in terms of clinical expression, because they're obviously we would like to get them off both of those, and I think that there still is that mythology that you can't do that, and that's just simply not true.
I have a question relevant to gender differences possibly in some of these models that we've had that having to do with the tonic versus phasic stimulation. And that is, I've heard that if I recall, the shell of the nucleus accumbens doesn't show as much habituation because there's very high levels in the shell of cholinesterase, acetylcholinesterase, that was postulated in the article, I'm trying to remember the author now, that maintains a phasic kind of a responsiveness, but that wasn't true in the core. And then when I heard about these differences with the muscarinic and other sorts of modulators of these processes, I was wondering, are there gender differences? Is there any place else, first of all, in the central nervous system where there's higher concentrations of cholinesterase, A, and are there gender differences in that, this distribution throughout the brain?
Anyone want to handle that one?
So, I mean, I don't know if there are gender differences in cholinesterase or not. So, I don't know if anyone's looked. Do you know? Gender differences in the It certainly. Yeah, so Al probably would know quite a bit about it.
I'm not certain that I know because I'm going to be citing some studies that we did in the 1970s. So this is a hell of a long time ago, obviously. But what I do remember that might be relevant to this issue is we were doing some studies that were funded by the Air Force Office for Scientific Research. So this was all related to the defense system. So I was being some kind of a Trumpy or something. But at any rate, what we were looking at was cholinesterase inhibitors. And we were doing the usual things that we did back then. Strain differences existed, yes. Sex differences existed, yes. The females were, once again, like nicotine, less sensitive to diisopropyl fluorophosphate. But I don't remember that we saw any differences in cholinesterase activity. That I do not remember, but I do remember sex differences in terms of sensitivity to DFP, which yada, yada, yada. If the metabolism is the same, points towards blah, blah, blah. But all that could be crap because it's 40 years.
No, very good. So nice discussion this morning. I encourage you to continue the discussion over lunch, which is next door, and then we'll reconvene here at 1:30 for some more talks and some more discussion. Thank you.